Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I'm tomato soup enthusiast Dusty O'Connell. Joining me is most hated man on Vikings Twitter, writes for zonecoverage.com, Arif Hassan. How you doing, Arif?
I'm good, despite, I guess, the antipathy everyone has for me now.
Are you upset that no one likes you or your work anymore?
Not really. I'm mostly upset that people sometimes don't understand the argument. The thing that gets me now is, so I published this article. I was like, hey, the Saints, who the Vikings are playing in the playoffs after they won a playoff game, is they're good, and that's the article, right? It's not like a super difficult take for a team that went 13-3. And there's some people in the comments of that article that are just convinced that there's some anti-Vikings conspiracy going on, with me pointing out that hey, the Saints team that won a playoff game that the Vikings were playing is pretty good. People are oh, I guess we shouldn't even try and play them then. I was yeah, it's true. Every time someone points out a team is good, you got to give up. That's the rules.
Let's just admit defeat now. Call it a season. We'll see you next year, guys.
Right? No. It's just wild. I think people are preconditioned, I think, to hate pieces that I write at this point.
Well, yeah, and you didn't even say anything bad about Case Keenum.
I don't even know if I mentioned him in the article. I didn't even say the Saints were better than the Vikings. I just said, hey, the Saints have a case of maybe being better than any other team in the NFC. I don't know. The Vikings match up really well with them, though. That's it.
Yeah. I mean, you didn't even invoke the Vikings until the very end.
Right. So, whatever. I hate the Vikings, I guess. So let's talk about the Vikings.
Yeah. So I guess there's a game. Before we dive into a preview of the Saints game, where I will endeavor not to rehash the think pieces that are coming out faster than I can read them, wanted to say thank you to Matthew Cotto for a donation via the PayPals. If you believe that Norse Code is an endeavor worth supporting, throw a few bucks in our tip jar at paypal.me/NorseCode, or go to our Patreon page at patreon.com/NorseCode and become a recurring monthly contributor to the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings, Norse Code. On to the preview. Much has been made, as you were alluding to in the introduction, about how good the Saints are and also what a good matchup the Vikings present for them. Let's lead with our best foot forward, and I wanted to ask you about how, given the kind of four-headed attack of Alvin Kamara and Mark Ingram, and then also Michael Thomas and Ted Ginn, and their short yet extremely accurate leader, much like you, actually. What are the Vikings most likely to do defensively to try and contain all four threats at once?
Drew Brees is a bit more mobile than me. I'll say that's probably the only place where that comparison falls flat. The only place. So I mentioned kind of briefly in the piece that it makes a lot of sense for the Vikings to emphasize kind of man coverage concepts. Like I said, they do match up pretty well. It's not often that, for example, Ingram and Kamara will be on the field at the same time, although that has happened. There was a pretty good play that the Saints dialed up against the Panthers that had both of them going out for screen passes. That ended up generating quite a bit of yardage, I think, for Ingram on the pass. But for the most part, I think that the Vikings do match up well. I mean, Michael Thomas is a really good route runner. He's one of the top 5 receivers in the NFL, which is interesting because no one talks about him. People talk about AJ Green and Julio Jones and Antonio Brown, but Michael Thomas is really good. He's maybe not that good, but he's really good. But it's Xavier Rhodes. You have a lot of faith in Rhodes. Even after he had a bunch of troubles sort of in the middle of the season, it's easy to just have faith in Xavier Rhodes and being able to shut someone down. So, maybe Michael Thomas, doesn't get, 0 yards, but I doubt he'll get over 80 yards with Xavier Rhodes, and that's pretty good. I think that if you kind of maintain man coverage concepts, it's not as if Michael Thomas will be able to exploit a particular weakness of Rhodes. And, in the past, he's had trouble with quicker receivers. Even that has kind of fallen by the wayside with how he's handled quicker receivers over the past 2 years. But Michael Thomas isn't exactly that. He's just a really good route runner. He's very good at winning contested catches, which is something Xavier Rhodes is very accomplished at defeating. On the other side, Ted Ginn and Trey Waynes. Waynes has been playing well for the past 8 weeks, really well for the past 8 weeks, arguably even better than Xavier Rhodes against, inferior competition, I guess. But, Ted Ginn is kind of a perfect matchup because of, the kind of threat that they present and the kind of threat that Waynes just inherently is meant to stop. He's a speed demon, and he should be able to prevent stuff from going downfield. I'm a little worried, maybe if Ted Ginn cuts inside and stuff like that. But, for the most part, I think that they match up well. I mean, you're going to have to figure out what to do if, Michael Thomas, slides into the slot against Mackenzie Alexander, and or Terrence Newman. Tommy Lee Lewis is on the field and stuff like that. But for the most part, they match up pretty well. Eric Hendricks is pretty good in coverage, and so you can ask him to handle Ingram or Kamara, and if it's both, I'd ask him to handle Kamara. But yeah, and that'll allow the Vikings to engage in a lot of different blitz looks and blitz packages. Brees, obviously, like any elite quarterback, is really good against pressure, but this year against pressure, he has been a lot more likely to throw interceptions. The drop-off of Brees from in a clean pocket to under pressure is a little bit more than I think most quarterbacks. Part of that's just because Brees is a little bit of a maestro in a clean pocket, but when you look at his under pressure splits, he drops off a little bit once you account for the potential to throw interceptions. So, that's something that I think, man coverage will allow them to be able to do. And it'll force Brees, I think, to wait a little bit longer, which will allow the pressure to come. And so I think that's kind of where they want to emphasize what they can do. I think, who is it? Andrus Peat is injured for them, and that's going to be pretty big. So they may be able to generate pressure up the middle through Tom Johnson and all that. And I think that's probably the best way to attack that Saints offense. Sometimes they'll throw in confusing looks, mix zone and man concepts, and so on. But I think that's less effective against Brees than it is against younger quarterbacks.
So I was noticing that Drew Brees has thrown for a mere 899,000 yards this year instead of his customary 1 million. How much of that do you think is a result of the relative strength of their run attack this year, which has been less prominent in past years, and how much of it is Brees, just getting old and slowing down?
It really doesn't feel like Brees is slowed down at all. It feels like he's much the same quarterback he was even a few years ago. I think a lot of it has to do with the rushing attack, and I think a lot of it also has to do with their defense. They're just in fewer shootouts, and so they have the ability to just kind of dial back and not play so up tempo, and they don't have to throw the ball as much. So I think those two both play a role. I think also Sean Payton has just become a better play caller. And so, I remember, back in 2009 when the Saints were on that undefeated run for a while, they would call deep passing plays up 40 points. They would just do it. And this year, they've been a little bit less aggressive about it and a little bit more willing to trust, the running backs to sort of kill the clock. So I think it's kind of a combination of those three things. But I think how good the running game has been a big part of it. Yeah.
The Saints are a little bit banged up on the offensive line. Like you said, no Andrus Peat, and they're missing. They're missing Zach Strief as well. Do you think injuries on the line will present any openings for the Vikings, or are the Saints players relatively interchangeable at those positions?
No, I think those two players are really important. I think that it'll give a lot of opportunities, especially to Danielle Hunter. The Vikings have the pressure production from the defensive line has kind of dropped off since a week 10 or so. And I don't think there's any problem with the talent level of the Vikings defensive line or anything like that. But this is kind of a good way to get it restarted. And with Strief out and with Andrus Peat out, I think that's probably an avenue where the Vikings have the ability to, even if they only rush 4, to create pressure. The Saints have historically just continuously had good offensive linemen, but there's a point where that stops, and I think we're kind of there. I think that they'll be able to generate pressure just with the front 4 because of that.
Excellent. Do you have a prediction on number of sacks that the Vikings?
I don't know. Brees has a crazy quick release, and he's very mobile. I think really the question is more, how often they'll get pressure. I think they'll get a ton of pressure. I don't think they'll get a ton of sacks. I'll say 2. But that's not the only way that pressure works, and maybe they'll be able to force a turnover because of it.
Yeah, speaking of Brees' slightly increased propensity to throw picks, how many interceptions do you predict?
I want to say I would like 2, but I'm going to say 1. It's going to be a relatively clean game, but it's probably going to be enough, I think, for the defense to prevent points from going up on the board.
What is the, I guess, least discussed aspect of the matchup between the Vikings defense and the Saints offense at this point?
That's a pretty good question. I think that maybe the role that Harrison Smith might play, without a super good threat at tight end for the Saints. It's not like Josh Hill is like bad or anything, but also like he's Josh Hill. You're not talking about like that one-on-one matchup. Like people will talk about the cornerback wide receiver matchup. People will talk about the linebacker running back matchup. But Harrison Smith is like an agent of chaos. He can just kind of show up wherever and ruin people's plans. I think that he'll play a pretty big role, and I think he'll be a really big part of the run defense. The Saints, the running attack is pretty good, but I think that's going to get slowed down by the fact that they've got a couple of injured offensive linemen, and I think that when they run up the middle, they kind of rely on, like any team does, on their ability to get guards on backers without having to worry too much about the safety, and that's not really something you can do against Harrison Smith. Like a lot of people and a lot of teams, when they deploy safeties in run defense, they're mostly like force or contain players on the outside. But Harrison Smith has been really good at generating run stops on the inside of plays. So he'll be a really big part of that. And I think that when Alvin Kamara runs to the outside or anything like that, he'll also be a really huge part of blowing up those runs. So I think that he's going to be kind of like the X factor for the Vikings. I don't know that the Saints have they just have like everything out there. They've got, those 4 players, Andrew Brees, they're all extremely good. But I don't think they have anyone that, can do the same thing that Harrison Smith can do on defense, on offense. Like you would need some sort of like weird gadget player like Percy Harvin in order to kind of match that kind of sense of chaos. And I don't think they have that. So I think that maybe the most under-discussed element is probably the role that Harrison Smith will play. He could blitz off the edge. He could be important in run support. He could play man coverage against, one of the running backs if need be, or a tight end. And he can just show up and grab a pick.
Harrison Smith, Satan's Crowbar.
That's a really good nickname. He's got like 8. I like to add that one to the list.
So let's talk a little bit about the other side of the ball, which is going to endear you to the 3 fans you have left on Twitter. It's pretty clear that our offense is potentially a liability against a surprisingly good Saints defense. They're not terribly known for it, but of course, Marshawn Lattimore is right up there with Xavier Rhodes in terms of cover corners, and their line is no slouch either. So how much impact do you think the speed of the Saints defense will have on Case Keenum being able to get the ball out and make some progress downfield?
Oh, no, it's going to be I think the speed of the defense is going to be a big part of it because of Keenum's arm strength concerns. If he tries to fit into a tight window against a fast defense, that'll increase the opportunities to get a pass deflection or a pick. I'm kind of curious what they're going to do with Marcus Williams, who's the rookie safety out of Utah. At Utah, he played really far back, like a very deep free safety that relied on his speed to generate good coverage, but it also meant he wasn't targeted that much. And so you didn't really get a good sense of necessarily of who the player was. But, so far in this year in the NFL, he's been pretty good. He hasn't been like, Marshawn Lattimore good or anything like that, but he's been pretty good. And I think he and Lattimore both have the speed to close down on those balls and create, pass deflections and interceptions. One of the things I pointed out in the article previewing the Saints is that Marshawn Lattimore has like the 4th highest ball hawk rate in the NFL. And ball hawk rate is something I picked up from Mike Band, who's an analytics consultant, formerly of the Vikings, now for NFL.com, and formerly of Roster Watch. And he mentioned that it's a pretty good proxy to figure out, what defensive backs can do. And it's just a combination of, pass deflections and interceptions divided by targets. how often they get their hand on the ball. And his is like the 4th highest in the NFL. He does a really good job of tracking the ball, closing down on it, and so on. And when you've got a quarterback who's got some arm strength concerns, it's something to kind of be aware of. So yeah, I think those two players will play a pretty big role in kind of determining whether or not Case Keenum can be aggressive, or to what extent he can be aggressive, because that can create a lot of problems for the offense. And it's really worth pointing out, and I said this in the article, but it's really worth pointing out, they only allow an average of 17 points per game when Marshawn Lattimore is healthy. And it seems like he's healthy. So, that's something to be concerned about. On the other hand, Ken Crawley, who I think is an underrated cornerback on the other side of the field, I think he's not up to the talent level of Diggs or Thielen, but it is worth noting that he is actually also a fairly good player. And it so happens that in a lot of games that Marshawn Lattimore's been injured, Ken Crawley has also been injured. And so you can't really use like a plus-minus system to try and determine kind of what the drop-off is between the two. He's pretty good, but I think that Diggs and or Thielen, whoever ends up on him, will probably create some space, and maybe that's where Keenum can take advantage of some of the weaknesses in that Saints defense.
The Saints have had a great deal of success using alternately Ingram and Kamara as short-range receivers. They have combined approximately 9,000 receiving yards between the two of them. How much do you think the Vikings are going to try and do something similar with either Latavius Murray or Jerick McKinnon, or both?
McKinnon's touches have been kind of dropping off over the past couple of weeks, which kind of sucks, but it's partially driven by how successful Murray has been. So it's not like McKinnon's been bad. It's just that Latavius Murray's been good. I think we'll see a lot more McKinnon in this game. One of the things that sticks out to me about the Saints defense is, you mentioned they've got a great secondary, they've got a good defensive line. They don't really have good linebackers. And so if you can isolate McKinnon in space against them, especially like on a route or something like that, where he can run like an angle route or a route out of the slot, I think you can generate some advantages. And so I think that's going to be important. I think we're going to see a pretty sharp increase in touches for McKinnon, in part because of what he can do in the passing game against them. But Murray's no slouch. He has the ability to catch the ball, even if he's not, running as fast as McKinnon is, deep downfield or anything like that. So I think that they may end up mirroring the kind of use pattern that Ingram and Kamara have, even if they're like, maybe not quite as productive or not quite as good as those two running backs. Yeah, no, that's a good way to put it, because, they might, pull something like the Saints did last week and put both of them on the field and have them both running, screen patterns, and they would both be pretty effective at that. I think that maybe the weakness of that offense is finding ways to attack those linebackers, and having, McKinnon and Murray doing that is probably going to help set up success. And then, of course, running up the middle, too. That defensive line is good, but again, without, great linebackers, you're going to have trouble stopping the run. And I think they're like the 18th best team in the NFL, so 14th worst, I guess, or something like that, at stopping the run. So they'll probably run it up the gut with Murray and have a bunch of pass patterns out for McKinnon.
So if the unthinkable happens and none of this works, how much pain are the Vikings going to put up with from Keenum before they start contemplating a change at quarterback?
I think it would take a lot. I think part of it is that you're kind of pot committed at quarterback. Part of it is that they just didn't play Teddy that often. And obviously sort of the two dropbacks that he had weren't great. I mean, they were both dropped passes from receivers, so it's not like they were his fault. But that first dropback, he looked, pretty nervous or whatever, right? And so you can't really feel super comfortable with it. I don't know what's going to happen. Like, the practice is occurring as we're recording it right now, the first Wednesday practice. And so, maybe they'll activate Sam Bradford and we'll have a discussion about who the real backup is or whatever. From my understanding, the way Kevin Seifert put it on ESPN about a week and a half ago is that Bradford is probably going to slot into that third quarterback role, just for simplicity's sake, because, the whole point is that he's better than Kyle Sluter. Not that he's necessarily, he might be, but he's not necessarily better than Teddy. And so just slotting him into that third spot might make sense. But, he's had dropbacks more recently. So maybe that's the debate, but I don't think that Keenum would have to like screw up royally, like far beyond my most pessimistic expectations. I think before they consider just benching him for performance related reasons. If he throws like 3 picks and they're actually caught, in the first quarter of the first half, maybe they consider it, but I think it would take a lot. Like it's not like the FBS National Championship game where you just have. It just makes sense for a college coach to be like, "Yeah, you suck. Bye." Like it's people are a little bit more stable in the NFL with their quarterbacks.
So 10% or less chance, barring injury.
Yeah, I think so.
All right. So what do we do about Lattimore? Like he's probably going to be on Thielen, right? Just because Keenum and Thielen have such great chemistry, right. And he appears to be the sort of wide receiver one. Like, how is that going to be a consistent matchup throughout the whole game, or do you think they will potentially line him up in the slot? Like, what do you anticipate his role being, and how the Vikings try to work around him?
The Saints have done a lot of shadowing of their receivers, or of their cornerbacks, and so. Like I think against Julio, for example, Lattimore, in both their games ended up covering him in over 75% of snaps. In week 1, they didn't do that, and so the Vikings would put like Laquan Treadwell out there on the left side so that Lattimore could deal with them, and then you just kind of ignore it. That's no longer the case, and so he'll probably follow Adam Thielen around. I still think there's a good argument that Diggs is like a better receiver, but it doesn't really matter because Keenum just wants to target Thielen more, so it makes more sense from the Saints side of things to try and shut down Adam Thielen. And I think he will follow Thielen around. If not, he'll follow Thielen and or Diggs, right? Like he's not going to end up just hanging out with Jarius Wright this time. So in order to deal with them, I don't think it makes sense to just refuse to target him or anything like that. But I think that sort of the threshold should be, a little bit higher for those targets. I think Thielen will get his. It's kind of like Michael Thomas and Xavier Rhodes, right? I don't think that Thielen's going to get 0 yards, but I would be, I guess, pleasantly surprised if he got over 100 or maybe even over 85. Lattimore's just really good. Thielen obviously really good. Lattimore's really good. That's not to say Lattimore is undefeatable or anything like that. Julio put up over the course of 2 games 213 yards on him just when Lattimore was in coverage. And so, and he's basically shut down every other receiver, but that really reveals sort of like, that he's not invincible and that there's a crack in the armor and so on. And I think Thielen, who's athletic enough and a great receiver and a great route runner, should be able to find sort of those open spaces. What's kind of interesting is like someone was trying to contest this argument that Lattimore had lost to Julio because Lattimore still hasn't given up a touchdown all year. And I was just like, I mean, I guess, but like 210 yards is like pretty bad. I kind of don't care that it was Tevin Coleman who scored those touchdowns, right? Like they got to the end zone and then someone else scored them. Who cares? But yeah, it's something to think about that like he hasn't allowed a touchdown all year. So yeah, I wouldn't say completely avoid targeting him or anything like that, but yeah, I mean the whoever he covers, the other matchup should just be way more enticing anyway, and so they should just bias very heavily in favor of throwing at Crawley, or in the slot PJ Williams, who's also been having a pretty good year actually.
So, given the kind of similarities in scheme between the Saints and the Vikings offense in this game, at least, do you anticipate an expanded role or number of targets for Kyle Rudolph?
Yeah, I think so. I like Marcus Williams as a safety. I already forgot Von Bell, I think, is the other safety. And I liked him as a prospect, but I don't think he's playing well. And so, like I mentioned, they've got linebacker problems. I think that that's going to create a lot of opportunities for Kyle Rudolph because I don't think Marcus Williams is very good at things like man-to-man coverage against a safety. And I think that though the Saints run a lot of cover one concepts with the single high safety in the middle, there's still going to be a lot of space open for Kyle Rudolph. I think that this is kind of a game where you want to lean on the tight end and the second receiver because of the opportunities that'll be created there. So yeah, actually, kind of surprised I didn't say anything about Rudolph. Yeah, he's probably going to get his. Like that, I wouldn't be surprised to see an 8 to 10 target game for him just because of the way those matchups work out.
Ideally, with one of them in the red zone for an increasingly rare Vikings passing touchdown.
Right, yeah.
How many snaps do we go before one of our starting offensive linemen goes out injured?
Like 3.
I knew you were going to say 3. Is it going to be Pat Elflein?
That would make me way too sad. I guess from a cost benefit standpoint, it's obviously it's better if it's Searles, but
that's not going to happen. Come on,
right?
It's
going
to be one of the keys.
The reason Elflein in particular would make me sad is not because he's so amazing, although he has been a big part of making the run game going. Matthew Coller's been, I think, the biggest Pat Elflein fan, and he's written a couple of pieces at 1500 ESPN about why Elflein makes the offense go. But I do think that his inconsistencies and problems in pass protection don't make him kind of like an open and shut case. So if he gets injured, Joe Berger slides inside, and they play, I don't fucking know, Danny Isidora at guard. That's probably not as bad as if, or I guess Bremer's at guard, and who plays tackle then? Oh, Rashad Hill. Yeah, I guess that's actually probably better than if Riley Reif gets injured and they have to play Rashad Hill there. So I don't know. I'll say it's actually the worst of all possible worlds. The best performing lineman, Joe Berger.
Ooh. That's interesting. See, I was going to put my money on either Elflein or Reif being, done for at least the half after,
See, that's why
2
I
snaps.
put my money on Berger, because no one thinks about it.
Who do you think, which unit do you think ends up with more yards? The running backs or the wide receivers?
That's kind of interesting. I think the game will be kind of close, so I don't think you can necessarily predict a pass heavy or a run heavy set. So, I'm going to go with the running backs, just because the matchups for the running backs, even in the passing game, are just a little bit more juicier. Yeah, juicier.
The most juiciest.
More juicier
than a Juicero.
You don't know this. Ben and I made fun of the Juicero guy on the Wide Left podcast when we were recording last night. It hasn't published yet, but it's the Juicero guy is also the raw water guy. So.
Oh, the puddle water guy?
Yeah.
He's sneaking through people's yards at night with bottles of pilfered raw water. Just please don't squeeze the bag. Please do not reveal that the Juicero is just an over-engineered. They'll just really throw money at anything nowadays, won't they?
I kind of hope you have to be connected to Wi-Fi in order to drink raw water. That would be the best.
So I think that they should make a deal with that. She's a 11-year-old girl that devised the Arduino lead testing system that's like super cheap for water. They should do a deal with her and include her test kit with each bottle of raw water, so you can test to ensure that it's safe to drink.
Well, from a lead perspective, yeah.
Relatively speaking.
Right. Like you want it to fail some tests because it's activated live water. Like, it's just full of those life-giving parasites.
The water can't be too clean. Can't have that.
Right.
So if you're Mike Zimmer and you win the coin toss, do you elect to kick or receive?
I mean, he will elect to kick, but I always actually like to receive first. Because if you score first, which is obviously slightly more likely if you receive first, I think you have better control over the pace of the game. People like to kick first now in the NFL because it gives you an opportunity to like double up on possessions, the end of the half, the beginning of the half. But like mathematically, that actually doesn't make any sense at all. So I'd rather have control over the pace of the game than to be tricked by math.
It's a very Arif way to look at it. We've seen players and coaches exhorting fans to be, crazy, insanely loud at this game. And we've even had some people who attend frequent games at US Bank Stadium, like putting out primers on Reddit and Twitter for how to be loud effectively, with tips such as you can use both your hands and your mouth to make noise simultaneously, and possibly even your feet.
Are you kidding? Have people actually been... What?
Yeah. At least one guy has a 10-point primer to how to be loud effectively. I'll try to track it down and put it in the show
How
notes.
I spent my childhood. That's what that is.
No, my tantrum throwing career has revealed heretofore unbeknownst benefits as a football fan.
Yeah, you know what? We'll include it in the show notes, man. Let's learn about how to be loud.
So do you agree that this will be like the loudest game in US Bank Stadium history?
Hell yes. Not only because US Bank Stadium has like very limited history, but I mean, come on, man. It's this like somewhat like I think what BJ Rydell wrote a piece at Zone Coverage, and just general, and people have been saying in general, like this is like a huge game for Vikings fans, like in so many ways. Like obviously for the Vikings players, like whatever, right? Only one of them was there for the 2009 championship game, and he might like retire after this year, right? Like it's a totally different. For Vikings fans, it's like yesterday, right? It's gonna be loud as hell, yeah, for sure.
Well, especially for people who listened to the episode of the podcast earlier in the week.
That was fun, but very frustrating.
I know. The wounds will be fresh. So if the other unthinkable thing happens and the Vikings make it to the big game, do you think the record they're about to set for loudest game will or will the Super Bowl be louder?
Like beat the Chiefs and or Seahawks, who currently hold the record, I guess.
Well, no, I just mean within US Bank Stadium. Like this is going to set the US Bank Stadium record. If the Vikings do the unthinkable, will that game surpass it, or will the emotions that are clearly quite raw make this game still the loudest?
I think this game would be louder than like the Super Bowl or a potential matchup with the Falcons, because like the emotions are raw. And I just feel like a lot of people, like, for the Falcons game, a lot of people, like, blame Gary Anderson or reality. They don't tend to blame the Falcons that much. For the Saints game, it's like, oh, yeah, not only did, like, the refs screw us, like, the Saints are awful. They're dirty cheaters. Like, it's very easy to just be angry about that. And it's like 10 years more recent. And obviously, the Super Bowl it's only going to be like 25% Vikings fans in there. So it's going to be difficult to generate that kind of noise. So I think that record will, against the Saints in the playoffs is just going to hold for a long time. Like the only way it could get any louder is if there was a playoff matchup against the Packers at home, but that's about it.
Customary noise-making protocol indicates that you should generally be quiet when the offense is on the field. Peyton Manning famously was frustrated with Denver fans because they wouldn't stop cheering.
Right, because he trained the Indianapolis fans, but the Denver fans just raw and untrained, uncouth.
And it affected Peyton Manning's particular style of play, which is basically to be his own offensive coordinator, and making that degree of noise makes it hard for him to change the play at the line of scrimmage. Given the Saints' propensity for man defense, I mean, do you anticipate them trying to switch coverages depending on how the Vikings line up? And if so, do you think it's to our benefit to just scream and stamp our feet all the time to try and confuse the defensive backs into maybe doubling up on the wrong receiver?
Yeah, no, for sure. I think that'll have an effect. Especially because the Vikings offense does have like a lot of motions and stuff like that, where they, move backs out of the backfield or they move receivers across formations and stuff like that. I think that kind of noise level will definitely add to the kind of confusion, especially because I'm not entirely sure who the defensive sort of play caller is for the Saints. But I imagine that they will be particularly frustrated. Yeah.
So the idea is to use all of your noise-making implements to generate a situation where both the Saints' offense and defense are like, what?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Excellent. That's it was not covered in the primer, by the way.
Yeah, that's my bad.
Well, no, I'm just saying the primer follows the customary protocol.
Oh, right, right.
Quiet on offense, but I do not subscribe to that. If I was there, I would be voiceless for the following week after the game.
Right. Yeah. So I think like offensively, like there's probably situations where that would be very frustrating. But it's less important, I think, for the Vikings on offense than it might be for the Saints on defense. That said, there's going to be instructions in the stadium, quiet on offense or whatever, that'll be flashed throughout, like on the boards and stuff like that. So maybe I guess I would pay attention to that. But if there's no such instructions, I think it would actually make sense, unless like they have to go to a loud count and then you start causing false starts. At that point, just maybe quit it. We'll see. Like test out the noise levels, I guess, early in the game. See what happens. See if the offense is feeling it. If not, you can be quiet on offense. It's okay.
So you bring up false starts. What do you think the penalty situation is going to look like in this game? Are we going to, well, first of all, how many first downs are we going to hand the Saints when Xavier Rhodes gets called for pass interference?
It depends on who's calling the game.
Oh. Well, at least it won't be Jeff Triplett. We got that going for us.
Yeah, right. Hopefully it's not Pete Morelli. How angry would Vikings fans be if it was Pete Morelli? Good God.
Oh, the gnashing of teeth and rending of garments would begin during the game.
Right. The Vikings are not a super penalty prone team. It's just the games that they committed a lot of penalties are very easy to remember. The Panthers game, the Pittsburgh game, both losses incidentally.
Well, we would have won that Panthers game if we hadn't just handed them a field where they scored.
It was like over 120 yards or something in penalties. It was just brutal. And then the Bengals game where it didn't matter because the Bengals were not there to play football.
They were just there to cash a check.
Yeah, they had found out that their coach was quitting before the game, and then of course 2 games later they found out that actually their coach was being extended.
Oh, yeah, about that.
Right. I can't imagine being in that locker room. Like, what is happening? Anyway, so it didn't matter. The Vikings committed a lot of penalties against the Bengals, but. So those 3 games, it looks like they're outliers, right? So I was talking about, like a couple of weeks ago, I was talking about like, this is weird. This Vikings team doesn't usually commit a lot of penalties. They're usually kind of in the bottom third, or even at the very bottom in terms of penalties committed, 2014, 2015, a little bit 2016, although I think they committed more penalties in 2016, if I remember. And then I looked it up, and the Vikings are still in the bottom half, maybe the bottom third of penalties committed. And so they either commit a ton of penalties or like very few. So that's what it happens to be. I think all of the was the Steelers game on the road. I want to say it was. I don't remember now, but I want to say the majority or a lot of the games where they committed a lot of penalties were on the road. So maybe that plays a role too.
You are correct. The Steelers game was on the road. Right.
So maybe they won't have to worry about it too much. There's statistical evidence, incidentally, for the likelihood that you commit fewer penalties at home. Although the question is kind of like, is it chicken or egg? Do you commit fewer penalties because you play better at home for other reasons and you don't have to commit penalties because you're not behind, or is it because the refs inherently biased towards the home crowd? And from my understanding, there is some evidence that the refs biased towards the home crowd. So in this case, maybe they'll commit very few penalties.
And I ideally will be in a situation where, being at home and creating this atmosphere of sound and fury will lead to a net increase in penalties from the Saints, who I believe are not a terribly penalty-prone team either this year.
I should look it up. They've got 2 players I know that commit a lot of penalties. One of them is an offensive lineman, I think, which is great news for the Vikings. The other one is Ken Crawley, who leads the team in penalties with... He has 7 accepted, 3 offsetting, and 2 declined. So quite a bit of penalties, actually. And that doesn't include the Panthers game, where I think he had 2 more. So, and this is kind of the thing is, if I was a Saints fan, I would definitely be frustrated with this guy, but as somebody who is cheering for a team opposite him, I'm a little bit annoyed that he actually manages to be good despite that. But he's somebody that could be prone to committing. I mean, he commits a lot of defensive pass interference penalties, and so targeting him deep downfield is just smart, especially because. So I looked this up. I think Keenum has thrown 14 passes that were later turned into defensive pass interference penalties in favor of the Vikings, which is a huge boost over, I guess, Teddy, who last year only threw, or not last year, 2 years ago, only threw like 6. So he's got that skill going for him. I don't know, like, how much of a skill that is, because a lot of it is just like bad defensive backs don't know how to react to underthrows. But, whatever. Ken Crawley commits a lot of pass interference penalties, and Case Keenum happens to throw a lot that get called for pass interference. So that's like a good synergy, I think. So, I think that for the most part, most of the Saints won't commit that many penalties. But I think that you've got a couple of opportunities to really exploit the yellow flags.
On the season, according to NFLpenalties.com, Minnesota has been assessed 100 penalties for 949 negative yards and benefited from 105 penalties, gaining a total of 928 yards. So a pretty narrow split. New Orleans,
even wash.
Yeah. New Orleans, however, has had 112 penalties called against them for negative 1,063 yards. And benefited from 110 penalties with a net gain of, or with a total gain of 868 yards. So they're a slightly more penalized team over the course of the season. We'll see how much of an impact that has on this particular game.
All right.
What else? What are your final hottest takes on either side of the ball for this matchup?
Final hottest takes. Well, I guess I think the Vikings are probably going to win. I mean, Vegas says they're going to win. But I think I will be in part vindicated for my Keenum take. And he doesn't have to lose for me to be right? And I think he's probably going to throw some dangerous passes that is further kind of going to create questions about whether or not he should continue to be the quarterback. He will be. I think it'll be very difficult for him to be, not the starting quarterback in the following game. But that's one of my hot takes. I think also it's also worth pointing out that I think the Saints have a much better special teams unit than the Vikings do, and I think the Vikings special teams unit is like fine. But Will Lutz is a really good kicker, which I just hadn't considered all that often. But he's a really good kicker. And he drains a lot of like 50 plus. I mean, he just hit that like 58 yarder against the Panthers last weekend. He's a pretty good kicker, but even more than that, Thomas Morstead is a phenomenal punter. Like one of the things about the Vikings punter Ryan Quigley, he doesn't have a very good leg. Like he doesn't kick it very far downfield. And so when you're backed up in your own territory, he's like kind of a shitty punter to have. But he's really good at getting balls to drop inside the 5. And it helps that, Marcus Sherrills is a really good gunner. But he hasn't kicked a touchback all season. And despite, that stellar record of having, like, I think the highest proportion of kicks landing inside the 5, Thomas Morstead is just a more valuable punter. Like, that's how good the Saints sort of special teams unit is. They've been pretty good, if I recall, at returning kicks and punts. But mostly it's those specialists that might produce a lot of hidden advantages. So if, like, the Vikings get a bunch of small advantages from, like, let's say, penalty differential, the Saints might generate a lot of advantages just through having like a superior special teams unit. And now that I said that, now I feel like I'm responsible if Kai Forbath misses a kick, which I don't want to be. But I guess those are the rules.
Well, that's okay. I was gonna follow up with who misses a field goal or an extra point first.
Oh yeah, definitely the Vikings.
let's hope it's an extra point now that the fantasy league is over.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Did anyone someone had Kai Forbath, right? Like they had to have.
Yes, I believe I was the beneficiary of a missed extra point by Kai Forbath. I forget if it was in the playoffs or not. I had, in every round except the final round of the playoffs, my opponent missed an extra point, which was instrumental in my securing victory over all you schlubs.
Your team played good defense, man.
It did. So there's a possibility that a few people will listen to this podcast. I imagine everybody who automatically subscribes to the show via iTunes or Stitcher, however many people that may be, we have no way to know, will have an opportunity to listen to this show before you tape the football machine. And I understand you open the phone lines for a relatively extensive question and answer period. Oh, are there any questions that you will refuse to answer during that period on the football machine tonight?
I mean, probably, but I'm not going to refuse to answer any questions that are like based on my takes. I don't know. Like,
I guess my question is like, what questions are so played out that you just have no interest in answering them tonight that people will probably ask?
I don't know. Usually if they're played out, we just answer them for like 10 seconds. I don't know. Like, because there's a bunch of tired narratives, but none so like beating a dead horse tired that I just refuse to answer them. Like what's an example to you that you think would be a question that kind of fits that?
For me, basically anything about Case Keenum at this point is, I think he's a pretty well-known quantity at this point, and I would be kind of bored answering questions about my expectations for him this game, which is why I didn't belabor it too much during this podcast.
I'll probably end up answering a bunch of Keenum questions.
That's kind of what I thought.
Yeah.
All right. Let's take a look at the mailbag. Our intrepid producer, James, writes in, is the matchup with the Saints a bit of a flipped script from 2009? In 2009, the Vikings had the multiple weapon offense and the adequate defense, and the Saints had the nightmare defense. This year, the Saints have the multiple weapon offense and the adequate defense, and the Vikings have the hardest hitting safety in the league.
That's James putting hardest hitting safety in the league in quotes. Just freaks me out.
Yeah, I'm doing air quotes around that. Yeah. Which why?
But yeah, the Vikings do have the hardest hitting safety in the league, Andrew Sendejo. But I assume he meant Harrison Smith. But I don't know, because like it's not quite the same, because the Saints also had like a pretty good offense in 2009, like I think a record-setting one, or a near record-setting one. Like I think one of the records that was set that Peyton Manning later broke again was most consecutive games with a touchdown pass. So it was like set by Tom Brady in 2007, and then I think Brees broke it in 2009, and then Manning broke it in like 2013 or 2014 or one of those Denver years. Yeah, that offense was really friggin' good. So I would say it's not quite that. But it is kind of like an inversion, right? Where the Vikings had this crazy offense and meh defense, where now they've got like an offense with questions. Like it's pretty good. Statistically, it's, in the top 10. But it's got questions. And then the defense is like, it's either the number 1 or the number 2 defense, depending on what you think about the Jaguars and how important turnovers are and stuff like that. So yeah, there's a little bit of inversion going on, but it's not quite a flipped script. Like I think the Vikings would need like some absurd offense in order for it to completely match.
Follow up: were you able to sleep soundly the night after watching the 2009 game and riff tracksing it on the podcast?
I mean, like I don't really sleep all that much, so it didn't really bother me.
No, I'm gonna go with no, but not because of the game.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Alex Goebel writes in, is there any merit to the idea that Pat Shurmur may have been calling a vanilla defense in the tail end of the season, or is that a fan fever dream and attempts to deny that the offense is a concerning factor heading into the playoffs?
Alex Goebel, I thought you would know that Pat Shurmur calls the offense. Come on, man. Yeah, the idea that Pat Shurmur's calling a vanilla game, some people have like DM'd me this question, and I don't think it's true, because the Vikings definitely had something to play for. In week 14 against the Bengals, right? 14, 15. No, I'm way off. 15. Week 15 against them. Not way off. Week 15 against the Bengals. Because, if they had won and the Eagles had lost, which was certainly a strong possibility at the time, they could have secured the number 1 seed, and so I don't think that he was calling a vanilla game then. And it's not as if the Vikings didn't really want to beat the Packers the following week, and that game got weirdly close for a little bit until the end. So I don't think so. I don't think that he was calling a vanilla game, and I don't think that like he was scheming together like, yeah, you should underthrow the ball here, Keenum. Like that would be great. So the problems that we've been seeing with the offense over the past couple of weeks, I don't think that they're in part a product of intentional obfuscation. I think that it's they were trying to win games, and I don't think that they were worrying too much about what to put on film, especially because Shermer has been consistently good about creating new concepts without needing that kind of help anyway. Like he'll do something innovative in week 2 or week 3, and that doesn't prevent him from doing something innovative in week 6. We say that again, so I don't think so.
I'm going to blame autocorrect for conflating offense and defense. This is pretty clearly a question about the offense and my own inability to proofread.
No, I blame Alex Goebel 100% entirely. Never listen to the show, Alex. I hate you.
Do us a favor and throw away all our podcasts. So your contention is the Vikings are just going to, play their game. Like there's not, we're not going to see a particularly gadgety or, curious offense because, our offense, tends to match up pretty well against elements of their defense, just the way it's called, other than, what you said about, potentially higher incidence of Jerick McKinnon.
Right. Yeah, I think so. And that's even kind of fitting within sort of the way the offense has worked, at least in the middle of the season, where they just kind of picked. They played both running backs, and then after like the first quarter, they just kind of picked whichever running back was playing better. That's like not too far from just game planning in favor of like Jerick McKinnon or something. I think Alex is a little bit right that like this is like concocted by fans to kind of assuage themselves of the concerns that they've like very rightly had over the offense over the past 3 weeks. This doesn't actually happen all that often. Like there was like I think a pretty high profile incident where I think was it the Bengals played the Jets and then they played the Jets like the following week in the playoffs or something. It was something like that. And the Bengals called like an intentionally bad game in order to like get a home field advantage against the Jets again, and then B to hide what they were doing, and then they just lost anyway. It doesn't matter. But so good job. But this really doesn't happen all that often.
Don from Ohio writes in, can any team realistically beat the Vikings if they minimize mistakes, stay disciplined, and don't turn the ball over?
I'm confused about the pronoun usage here. I assume that the they refers to the Vikings. If the Vikings don't make mistakes, and therefore, stay disciplined and don't turn the ball over, can any team beat the Vikings? Maybe the Patriots. I don't think the Saints are that team. I think the Saints are really good. I don't think they're that team. And the Saints are probably the next best bet for that. So if I don't think the Saints can win against a Vikings team that commits no mistakes, then yeah, no team in the NFC.
Ooh, a well-hedged take. What's more overhyped, the Saints offense or Dusty's tomato soup take? Oh, God.
Wait, what's your take? I thought you just liked it.
I know, I ate tomato soup. How is that a take?
I think what's overhyped is a tomato soup discussion. That's very clearly well played out and overhyped. Shouldn't have happened.
Yeah, I regret that everybody involved had to be a part of that. I think I tweeted as much. Tomato soup is delicious.
It's quite good. It's weird how they're, I don't know, like some people are like, tomato soup is awful. And it's like, well, I mean, I guess you don't have to have it. I just can't imagine having strong feelings about it.
It's not like my favorite food or anything, but it's it's a comfort food when I'm sick, which was the point of the initial tweet.
Yeah, it's not like turkey where everyone is, been besotted by a lie with wool pulled over their eyes about how good it is. It's tomato soup.
So I guess Saints offense then.
It's my process of
is the answer to the question. What are your top 3 most anticipated roster moves of 2018? I assume he means Vikings related.
Anticipated what they're going to do at the quarterback. I have no idea what they're going to do. But I highly anticipate like railing about the decision or whatever. I'm sure I'll be angry no matter what happens. Um, but, but that's one of the anticipated moves, like, who they sign. Other than that, like, I'm kind of curious what's going to happen with the offensive line because it's pretty clear it's not fixed yet. Plus, Joe Berger's about to retire. I don't really trust Nick Easton. So, and it's not like Riley Reef or Mike Remmers are like really long-term solutions. Like they're fine for now. But yeah, I guess whatever they do, and that might be drafting a guard in the first round. It might be signing a guard or a tackle in free agency. Who knows? So that's one of my sort of anticipated moves. And then other than that, maybe what happens with Terrence Newman? It'd be kind of cool if he ends up being like a defensive backs coach or something, or maybe he feels like he's got another year in him somehow through like some dark magic of some sort. Drinks a lot of wine, I guess. I don't know what my number 3 most anticipated move is. I'm sure it's like super obvious in retrospect, and someone's gonna like tweet us the actual whatever it is, and I'm gonna be like, oh yeah, obviously, but I don't know what it is.
Oh, that would be fine. Yeah, looking at the offseason, I feel like our most pressing needs are, of course, the ongoing offensive line, rotating cast, and possibly cornerback. In your mind, what would be the ideal number of new offensive linemen to start next season?
To start, probably 2. I would be okay keeping like Riley Reef and Mike Remmers, but I would like to have a replacement for Nick Easton and in the long term Joe Berger. And if Joe Berger stays, maybe you can find a way to replace Mike Remmers or something. Who knows? But 2 is probably ideal because I think that can really begin to strengthen that offensive line.
This question is dumb. I'm not going to read it. Zen Cupid writes in, we always hear about defense winning championships, but how often does the number 1 overall defense make it to the playoffs, and how deep do they typically go?
So I was asking about just the relationship between defense versus offense in winning in the playoffs. And I asked a statistician, I want to say Eric Eager at Pro Football Focus, about this, and the relationship to offenses winning is actually stronger than defenses winning. So this doesn't quite answer your question, like how often does the number 1 defense, whatever. Because, I have mentioned multiple times in comparison to the Vikings defense, a couple of number 1 defenses, 2015 Broncos, 2013 Seahawks. And then, before that, was the last time before it wasn't the 2002 Bucks. There had to be a number 1 defense somewhere in between. But, not terribly often, but it's not as if the number 1 offense, depending on how you measure offense and defense, obviously, it's not as if the number 1 offense is always there either. I do think it's probably a little bit more likely, but that could be weird because if the number 1 offense is very often the Patriots, and they're also just like a good team, and so to just evaluate it as offense without evaluating the context of like the organization surrounding them is maybe not super helpful. So I guess offense is a little bit more consistent than defense in getting there despite the conventional wisdom. But really, I think the difference is kind of marginal between which is more effective in the playoffs, and having an elite one of those units is pretty helpful, I think, which is, I know, a very strong take.
Yeah, that's the podcast equivalent of tweeting that defense wins championships. So
yeah, right.
Thank you for that. It appears the Saints' vaunted rushing attack has tailed off towards the end of the season. Does it seem like the Saints are mixing things up, or has the running game actually stuttered?
Yeah, I think it's kind of like a small sample thing. Like they did pretty poorly against Carolina, but Carolina's got a pretty good defense. Quan Short, Julius Peppers, those linebackers pretty good. I hear Luke Kuechly has done all right for himself. They have a pretty good rushing defense. And just for the most part, I think I don't really think it's like tailed off. I just think that you've got a couple of games where it hasn't been kind of up to snuff. I don't think it means anything.
Hunter writes in, will the Vikings use the heavy front offense where Aviante Collins comes in as a tight end for more success running up the middle, or go lighter and be more successful running to the outside?
I think they'll run up the middle. Also, Collins was pretty good in those snaps. Like I've dogged on that dude all year. Not all year, like he hasn't been on the roster for most of the year. But yeah, I haven't been a huge fan of the Vikings keeping him on the practice squad. I wasn't a huge fan of him in camp, and I made that pretty well known. He looked pretty good. He looked really good actually as the sixth offensive lineman, which that's not necessarily like it, right? Because Austin Wentworth was like a really good sixth offensive lineman before he moved inside, and he didn't do well, and then he had to retire because I think a blood clot in his knee. And then Jeremiah Searles, I think, was the sixth offensive lineman, I want to say. He hasn't been, amazing or anything like that. Rashad Hill, good sixth offensive lineman, and then also it turns out a good backup lineman. But, it's not necessarily indicative of how Collins is going to do long term. Either way, I think it makes sense to experiment more with that jumbo package, have Collins out there as a tight end, and run up the middle because those linebackers I am not super confident in for New Orleans. Which is not to say, running outside is a bad idea or anything like that. But, I think it makes a little bit more sense to run up the middle and just have McKinnon do some damage through the air instead of on the ground.
Bill Botke, our, at least one listener taking time out of his busy day at NASA to email our podcast a question. This is a great way to get your question read on the air, by the way. He writes, once again, I'm a huge fan of the show and of all of Arif's football analysis. Being an astronomer, all of it. I strongly appreciate his efforts to make objective arguments about the Vikings using statistical and video analysis. In my field, fun ideas are constantly getting shot down by new data and modeling work. While this can be a drag, we need it to find the truth. Keep up the good work.
Oh, thanks, Bill. I imagine there's tons of fun ideas in space science. Which he calls astronomy. I call it space science. Which have to be, I guess, shot down, right? Because we find some grainy film of like redshift or whatever. I'm just using space words now.
That's the problem, is that your degree is in footballology and not space science.
I just can't, like, it's got to be kind of deflating because the way you find out the truth in astronomy like takes a long time, and you like track the movement or like the stutter, like the blinking of a star, and you're like, oh, that's not a giant planet, that's dust.
Oh, that was artifact. Oops. Whoops.
Yeah, right.
Oh well. Bill continues. You said on Twitter that you wanted off-the-wall questions, so here is my nerdy question. Arif's breakdowns of Case Keenum and the New Orleans Saints are compelling, but they also leave one anxious as a Vikings fan. I am looking for solace. I find that the Saints only won 50% of their games on the road this year, 4 of 8, while the Vikings won 87.5% at home, 7 of 8. Using a Bill James formula, these values yield a win probability of 87.5% for the Vikings. I know I'm leaving out lots of complicating factors, but should I feel better?
He actually left a link to the paper that allows us to calculate the Bill James probabilities, which is so scientist. I love it.
The log 5 method to estimate the probability that Team A beats Team B.
But yeah, I think so. I think it's worth pointing out that there's a lot of value, I think, in saying the Saints are unusually sensitive to home field away splits. And I would say it's very easy to read into that over the course of one season. I think that the one season sample is a little bit too small. But this has been true for the Saints actually for a long time. To the point where I think like people like it was a joke like early, like I think in 2009 it was like a joke on 4chan, the sports thing, the /SP, which I, by the way, was not a member of, but there's way too many members of the debate team that were, where they would call him Home Babby. And as much as that was a joke, it kind of just bore out for a while that the Saints were indeed dome babbies and had difficulty playing outside of home. Yeah, I think that split is real and worth mentioning. The Vikings split at home is actually really good too. I don't know how much of that is something that we can kind of rely on, one season sample. But that's something that's worth kind of pointing out and interrogating that hey, the Saints might be pretty good, but they're kind of just a different team at home than on the road, and they have been for like 8 years. So yeah, probably help you feel better. I don't know about 87.5%, but
I think that's a curiosity of the way the formula is written, which was originally written to apply to baseball. I don't know if it makes a difference across sports, but
yeah.
I would like to provide some solace with the complicating factor that the Vikings played a more difficult schedule this year, which you would think would, boost their probability slightly.
It is kind of weird, right? Because the Saints are in the NFC South, and so they have to play the NFC South. And the toughest part of the schedule for the Vikings was the NFC South. But A, the Saints didn't have to play themselves. And B, the rest of their schedule was like meh. So yeah, the Vikings did end up playing like a tougher schedule despite them having to play their own division twice, and the Vikings only have to play in that division once.
Jonathan writes in via the email. If you would like to submit an email question, by the way, you can do so at norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. Yeah, Jonathan writes, did the relative shutdown of the Saints' rushing two-headed monster on Sunday give the Vikings a blueprint for taking Ingram and Kamara out of the game? Or do you think it simply demonstrated that the Saints are so good that if you're able to eliminate one facet of their attack, they'll just punish you thoroughly with some other facet?
Yeah, this is kind of like a plank off of one of the responses that people had to my piece, which was the Saints' rushing attack was completely shut down against Carolina, kind of neglecting the fact that the Saints still won and put up like 31 points against a pretty good defense. And so, that's I rolled my eyes at a lot of people who responded to the piece with, you're overhyping the Saints. They aren't actually good at all. Like, in what world, dude? But no, this is actually a pretty good point that, like, if you have the ability to concentrate your efforts and shut down one element of the game, they'll still have the ability to punish you somewhere else. I would say that it's a little bit of both, that they can provide a little bit of the blueprint for how to shut down one facet of the game, but you kind of have to tweak the plan that they put out there for you a little bit. Remember the Panthers almost won. They just, had to drive down the field, which, I guess Cam Newton doesn't have the intangibles this week. Some weeks he does, some weeks he doesn't. But it's close to a blueprint. I think that it gives you kind of the clues to the formula that you have the ability to kind of work out and solve yourself. So I think that, what they did to help shut down that rushing attack, and a lot of it involved, and they're typically like a zone defense, so that was probably part of the problem. But a lot of it involved, crowding those linebackers a lot closer to the line of scrimmage than they usually do. A lot of it involved, not being necessarily as aggressive shooting gaps as they very often are. Kind of like the Patriots playing against the Steelers and Le'Veon Bell last year. So that the elements of that kind of plan can come into play for the Vikings, but obviously they need to kind of adjust those elements to better account for the fact that the Saints are in fact multifaceted.
Brian writes in via email as well. I think I figured out the deal with Arif and many others, myself included, and Case Keenum. Oh, Lord.
Great.
Keenum is to quarterbacking as turkey is to entree meats. Can be just fine with the right side dishes to go with it, but shouldn't be relied on to save your Thanksgiving. What say you guys?
Yeah, that's both a good description of turkey and Case Keenum. Yeah, okay, fair. This is convoluted, but with the way that you put it, it's not bad.
Oh, gosh.
You need to spatchcock your Case Keenum before you cook it. That's probably the best way.
How many games did Keenum start this year? 14?
I think 13, but he finished 14 because he doesn't get credit for starting the Bears game, and he obviously won it.
All right. Well, I have happily cheered for Case Keenum in 13 football games this year, and I have eaten, in last year, and I ate turkey fewer than 13 times last year and was happy to do it, so no.
Well, but think about it this way. You're always cheering for your meal to be good, right? Like, the fact that turkey is there, you're like, well, I hope they didn't, screw it up too much. I don't know how that's much different from cheering for the Vikings in Case Keenum. Like, yeah, I want the Vikings to win. I hope he doesn't screw it up too much, right? Like, that's the whole, I think this analogy is working. The more we talk about it, the more Brian is convincing me.
All right. He also writes, some people seem to be pretty jazzed about the Falcons after their win on Saturday, praising both their offense and their defense. I don't think either their offense or defense played poorly, but I also don't think either of them were particularly astounding. The Atlanta defense made the Rams offense look average, which tended to happen this season whenever the Rams played against decent teams, and the Atlanta offense had just one touchdown drive that started in their own half of the field, and most of the yards in that drive came from a 52-yard screen pass to Mohamed Sanu. How would you grade the Falcons' performance?
paid a lot closer attention to that game than I did, honestly. So congrats, Brian. But okay, so there are a couple of things to say about this. The first, I think, is when you say something like, the Rams offense plays much worse than you'd expect one that productive to be against good defenses, it kind of pre-acknowledges that the Atlanta defense is good, right? Like, the defenses that are good examples of how this has occurred is, the Vikings defense, the Jacksonville defense, and the Seattle defense back when, I think in half of that game, Richard Sherman was healthy. I don't remember. I'm pretty sure Richard Sherman was healthy in that game, but I don't quite recall. But let's say he was, because I think it was relatively early in the season. So if you count those 3 games as good examples of how their offense doesn't play kind of up to their competition, you're putting Atlanta in that category, which obviously they're not as good as those 3 defenses. But when you say that the Rams offense performance reminded me of how the Rams perform in those games, it kind of, I think lends some credence to what the Falcons can do. I agree that the Falcons defense didn't look like they were world beaters out there. I do also think that with Desmond Trufant back and his reacclimation, I don't know, to the defense, I think that they are more likely to improve than get worse over this next week. So that's something to consider. They don't really have an astounding pass rush, which is something that Charles McDonald talked about when he was a guest on the show before the Falcons game. And so that's like worth noting. It's not an astounding defense, but the comparison alone, I think, kind of invites more praise than pause. As for the offense, I guess I was relatively impressed with it, but that's actually a pretty good point. A lot of it is that Matt Bryant is just an astounding kicker. So when the offense stalls, they still end up with like points, even if they're like 40 yards out. And so they have to like kick a 57-yard field goal. That's a pretty good point that they didn't necessarily lead any interesting drives aside from one that relied on a 52-yard screen. I think that maybe that's the case. It's difficult because I don't have a lot of confidence in their play caller, and the thing I was kind of looking for in this game was whether or not Sarkisian would actually call kind of a more competent game, and I think he did. And that's the thing that worries me about the Atlanta Falcons is if once Sarkisian kind of gets it together and calls games closer to how Kyle Shanahan called it last year, that team can be deadly. And so the patterns that I was worried about were there, even if kind of the end result of the performance wasn't. But, those are all fair points.
And finally, Kenneth Allen writes in via the Twitter, "Are we actually going to win this? I feel nothing but dread for days straight now." Well, did you watch the last episode of the podcast? Or listen, I guess?
I think the Vikings are likely to win 24-20 or something like that, right? If we're going to throw a score prediction in there. That
would cover the spread and hit the under. Is that did you bet on the game? Are you too superstitious for that?
Gambling is illegal, but if it wasn't, I definitely would have bet on the game in favor of the Vikings.
I'm surprised the line hasn't moved at all since.
I am too.
Since last week, it's still Vikings -4. So 24-20, and I like our chances. I trust Vegas. I trust our team. I will be on the edge of my seat, obviously, and it's probably going to be a nail biter. I mean, you know how the Vikings are about burying teams. It's probably going to come down to 5-6 minutes left in the fourth quarter, but I'm okay with that.
Yeah. So we actually ended up getting another question. I don't know if you skipped over it or if you didn't want to answer it, but I liked it, which was, would you rather the Vikings win in a blowout or win in overtime in a nail biter?
Well, I thought the answer to this question was pretty obvious, but it sounds like you feel like it's less obvious.
I think it is less obvious because there's a catharsis value to winning the nail biter, and I hate watching the nail biter, but I feel a lot better after it. So if I don't know the result, but it is predetermined to be a win, I'd rather it would be a nail biter, because it's much more enjoyable. Obviously, in terms of the way one evaluates a team and establishing a team's overall level of quality, the blowout is obviously better. But I think from a catharsis standpoint, the nail biter.
It was always our plan to trail at the half, thus deepening New Orleans' eventual humiliation. Also, what game were the refs watching?
What was your end? Was your end to the blowout?
Yeah. I would rather win that game 31-0.
Think of it this way. One of our worries about Keenum is that he's not been in many situations where he's had to drive for a win in the final minutes of a game. He could resolve that concern.
I would rather not think about it personally.
Yeah, obviously at the time the nail biter is way worse, but like 10 minutes after the game, nail biter's way better.
That's true. The high fives feel better at the end of a nail biter. But I mean, I got enough gray hair. Like you may not have that problem, but
I mean, I might. I have no idea.
It's true. Your beard could turn gray.
It's true. I got like red hairs in my beard, though. I have no idea what's up with that.
What?
Yeah, it's just like random red hairs.
Cool.
I guess. It's weird.
I would be okay if that was a trend that continued. You'd look hilarious with a red beard. I would enjoy
it's like 4 red. It's not going to be that many.
Oh, okay. So you just like leave them there? It doesn't concern you? You don't pluck them out or anything?
No, I just like notice them. I'm like, oh, that's weird.
Anything to add? I know, like I mentioned at the top of the show, there is a veritable fusillade of think pieces and preparatory pieces in advance of the game. Are you going to be inciting the wrath of Vikings Twitter in any other ways before?
No, my next
Sunday?
article is a positive one. It's
it doesn't matter. Everyone's still gonna hate it.
You're right. It shouldn't be a shock because again, most of my articles are positive. It's a good team. But now this one's about the third down defense. It's the best third down defense we have in like recorded third down history. Our records go back to 1991. It's the best third down defense we've ever had that the NFL has ever seen, as far as we can tell. I assume like the 1969 Vikings had a better one, but like as far as we can tell, it's the best third down defense ever, and I want to write about that. It's kind of interesting because the markers that kind of create that aren't there. So the Vikings are pretty good on first down, but they're not a top 5 team on first down. The Vikings have been pretty good at forcing third and long, but actually they're third in percentage of third downs that are on third and long. And so it's like kind of weird that they kind of set this unofficial, and I'm saying it's unofficial because the NFL hasn't acknowledged it, but official because it's in the NFL's stat pages, stat books. But it's kind of weird that they set this record despite not having like a bunch of the stuff that like pushes you to be at that spot. So I'm kind of curious. So I like trying to dissect this one because it's not a mystery, but it is like it's like something that like definitely deserves some exploration.
It would be pretty cool if it became like useful and predictive.
Yeah. Unlikely. I don't think I'm that good, but it would be.
Should I have a burrito or a sandwich for lunch?
Burrito.
Whoa, that was quick.
Yeah, it's just what I want, so.
Well, all right then. I shall adjourn to Qdoba. One final note. I have received scattered reports of donors not receiving their stickers. I will be remailing a batch of stickers out this week so that they arrive hopefully in advance. Well, yeah, I'll ship them out today so they hopefully arrive in advance of the game on Sunday so you can wear your Norse Code Pride on your laptop, your vehicle, or wherever else a bumper sticker size sticker fits. And,
by the way, I complained about not getting a sticker. I finally got one when we met in London, and it fell off my laptop. I'm sorry.
That's all right. I'll send you some more.
All right.
I've got an envelope with several for you to do whatever you feel like with. But yeah, my what's wrong with your laptop? Like mine, did you get like, too hot? do you have a hot monitor?
No, that would suck. No, it's it has a carbon fiber wrapper in it because I was an idiot.
Yes.
I just like, cause back in like 2000 whatever. I was like, it looks kind of cool. And now it's just like, wow, I can't believe I was that lame.
It's good for like bike parts because it's light and has high tensile strength. But otherwise,
yeah, but it's like a wrap. It doesn't actually. It makes the laptop heavier.
Yeah, like why would that's the opposite
the materials of the laptop.
No, now that is a bad take. A genuinely bad take. We will.
Anyway, it turns out stickers don't stick to it very well.
So if you were thinking about a laptop, don't do what Arif did and put a sticker on your dumb carbon fiber wrapped laptop. I'm sure it's fine. We will return early next week after the win to talk conference championship. But until then, demand excellence. Demand Norse Code. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music Podcasts, or wherever else fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, who can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. Our intrepid producer and occasional co-host James Pagachnik can be found on Twitter at Big Mono or curating the official Norse Code Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN. I'm your host with a firm grasp of the obvious, Dusty O'Connell, and my name is my handle on Twitter. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, your one-time donation can be made at paypal.me/NorseCode, or a recurring monthly contribution can be made by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. Please visit our website, norsecodepodcast.com, where you'll find links to our Facebook and YouTube pages, along with the episode archive and some other good stuff. And any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can be emailed to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. And on behalf of the entire Norse Code staff, thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.